Hi, I'm Mike Dukakis. Welcome to my Haverhill History Minutes. Haverhill played an enormous role in my life. It was my mother's hometown when she came over. Spent enormous amounts of time in Haverhill. Loved being there. Spent summers there. Loved the community and really consider myself, if not a son, pretty close to a son of Haverhill. My mother arrived in Haverhill with her family when she was 9. In 1913. Now, her brothers had preceded them by several years, and that was very typical of Greek families. First, the boys would go over, and they'd settle in, work in the mills, kind of set things up, and then bring the rest of the family. And unlike a lot of other Greek families where the boys would come over and then go back, or at least they'd plan to go back, this was a family, and I think this was largely because of my grandfather, who basically said, we're moving, we're leaving Larissa in Greece. And remember, my grandparents came from a little mountain village way up in northern Epirus. We're moving, we're coming, and we're going to settle. And my grandfather had a little more education than the average Greek immigrant, who probably hadn't spent more than 3 or 4 years in elementary school. He had gone to high school, and he had gone to high school in what was then predominantly Greek Western Turkey under the Ottoman Empire. So he had a lot of respect for educators. And the principal of the Winter Street Elementary School was a guy named Stanley D. Gray, who was a Down East Mainer, who was the principal and had a very special way with immigrant kids, not just my mother. I've heard this from other immigrant families. And it was Mr. Gray who really became almost a second father to my mother. Saw something in this little Greek girl who arrived at 9. I remember her telling me that for 6 months she didn't understand what was going on, and one day she woke up and she was speaking perfect English. And she was very close to Mr. Gray, and he to her. We have letters that she would write to him during the summer, because he'd go up to Maine during the summer break, and she'd continue to write to him. And he was the guy who essentially encouraged her first to stay in school and graduate from high school, itself very unusual for young Greek immigrant women, and then unescorted to go to Bates College in Lewiston, Maine. Unheard of in 1921, that a Greek immigrant girl would leave her home unescorted and go to a college. The tradition among Greeks is that one's middle name, if you're a boy, is your father's name. And my dad's name was Panos. So presumably my name would have been Michael Panos Dukakis. But my mother, always a rebel, wanted one of her boys to carry Stanley Gray's name. So I have the rather unusual Greek middle name of Stanley. It doesn't translate into anything in Greek. But she wanted one of her boys to carry that name because of this remarkable elementary school principal who played such an important role in her life. And she arrived at Bates in 1921, graduated Phi Beta Kappa in 1925. This Greek immigrant girl became a school teacher, taught for a couple of years in Ashland, New Hampshire, then came back to Massachusetts, decided she wanted to teach here, went to a teacher's agency. In those days, they were private agencies, placement agencies, and saw an opening in Walpole. This was just about the time Sacco and Vanzetti were convicted in Norfolk County. And she said to Miss Potter, who was the head of the agency, Miss Potter, this looks interesting, social studies, junior high, 7th and 8th grade, Walpole. Miss Potter said, I don't think I'd apply to Walpole, Miss Lucas. Interesting. Still enormous prejudice against Southern Europeans, let alone people of color. But she ended up teaching in Amesbury and spent 2 years teaching junior high in Amesbury, married my dad in 1929, and the rest, as they say, is history. Folks from Haverhill and Lowell, which is where my dad's folks settled, would come to see us in Brookline. We'd go to their houses. I mean, this was constant. So I spent lots and lots of Sundays. I spent at least a week every summer staying with my aunts and uncles, usually out on Broadway. I remember one of the great nights is when we went to Canopy Lake. Boy, that was kind of the berries. And this was before I-93 had ever been built. So Route 97 was the road to Rockingham. And during the summer, there were cars on 97, which was Broadway in Haverhill, lined up for miles trying to go to the racetrack. I mean, I remember that distinctly. So every summer, I'd spend time in Haverhill. We'd spend Sundays, many Sundays, during the rest of the year. And it was very much a part of my life in many, many ways. And we were part of a very close family, needless to say. My Aunt Efty, who was the only sibling in the family that never married, worked at the Treasurer's Office at City Hall for years and was a wonderful aunt to us. And all of those folks, my Uncle Nick, my Uncle Adam ran Adam's Men's Shop on Walnut Street. I remember the house on Lock Street before they moved out to Broadway. And in fact, the family had 3 houses on Broadway, 181, 344, and 343, and I remember them all very well. I remember the Madian Dairy next door to my Uncle Ted's house. There was a dairy out there. And some of the families that lived in the neighborhood. So it was an important part of my life. I remember going to John Greenleaf Whittier's homestead with my mother, who, by the way, taught in Amesbury before she married my dad, and used to tell me about how they used to take the streetcar to Salisbury Beach. And so when I really began getting involved in politics and thinking about running statewide, Merrimack Valley, Haverhill, Lowell were kind of like my backyard. And I remember once speaking to some group in Newburyport, and some woman coming up to me afterwards and saying, you know, the only Boston politician we know that knows how to pronounce Newburyport. They all come up here and call it Newburyport, and you pronounce it right, Newburyport. I said, well, that's from my mother. I learned that from her. So great memories, and obviously great memories of campaigns and wonderful people from Haverhill supporting me very, very strongly. And in a word, Haverhill was a very special part of my life from the time I was old enough to know what was going on around me and to speak and listen and understand things. And it continues to be. I mean, I never go back to Haverhill without thinking about that. Oftentimes, we'll take the train to Portland, Maine, and we'll be going right through Haverhill, and I remember the railroad station back in the old days, and I remember the heavy French-Canadian community that was part of the community, as well as the Greek community. My parents were married in the Greek church in Haverhill in 1929. These are great memories, and a great city which was very good to me, politically as well. Always supportive, and really a terrific community for me. Thanks for listening to my stories about Haverhill. Have a wonderful 375th anniversary, and remember,